Jian was, by all accounts, an expert at procrastination. It wasn't that he lacked talent, he could code circles around his colleagues, turning complex algorithms into elegant solutions that others struggled to even understand. But his life, much like his work, was in a constant state of delay. He was a genius stuck in a dead-end job, a software engineer at Virial Tech, a company that thrived on creating mind-bending virtual worlds for people to escape into. At least, that's what it seemed like to the rest of the world. For Jian, Virial Tech was a joke. The company's main selling point was that it let people live out their wildest fantasies in digital worlds, where they could be anything they wanted. No real consequences. No real responsibilities. People spent their days creating avatars, interacting in futuristic, high-tech cities, slaying digital dragons, or racing hover cars across neon-lit streets. The perfect escape, they said. But Jian wasn't escaping. He was working. And the pay, well, it was decent enough to keep him there, but that didn't stop him from playing games on the side, after hours, of course. Late into the nights, Jian would slip on his VR headset and dive into the worlds he secretly craved, ones that were so well-designed, so immersive, that he almost forgot to eat or sleep. He didn't care much for the stories these games told, or the people who played them. What he really enjoyed was breaking them. He'd often find himself inside a game that wasn't quite right, a piece of software no one had noticed, a glitch that no one had yet caught. And then, like any true digital artist, he'd twist and bend the code to his will, experimenting with things that no one else could dream of. He'd change textures, break objects into pieces, or even make the NPCs, non-player characters, do strange, hilarious things. It was fun. It was his thing, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the night he found it wasn't a typical gaming session. He had joined a new, experimental VR game, a hyper-realistic experience where you could actually feel the wind, the temperature, and even the texture of objects around you. The game was still in beta, and as usual, Jian was exploring the edges, trying to find hidden features, hidden secrets. That's when it appeared, a line of code, not in any language he recognized, hidden deep in the server logs that he wasn't even supposed to be looking at the logs. The game was running on a private server, a level of access reserved only for Vriel's top engineers. But Jian's curiosity had always been his best and worst trait. A few quick taps on his keyboard, a couple of shortcuts, and he was deep inside the system, peering at a segment of code that seemed wrong. It wasn't that the code was complicated, it wasn't. In fact, it was almost too simple, too clean. A string of characters that looked like a password or an access key, something that didn't belong in the game at all. Most codes in VR games were built in complex layers, intricately designed to make sure no one could break them. But this line? It was different. It had none of the usual protections. Could this be some kind of debug feature? Jian murmured to himself, tapping a few commands to try and decrypt the string. The code flickered. His screen blinked once, then twice. A strange warmth enveloped his hands, as if the virtual world was reacting to the code, pulling him deeper into itself. Jian frowned. He hadn't expected this. The system had never felt so alive. A new window popped up. Access granted. Welcome, creator. Jian blinked. His heart skipped a beat. What the hell is this? He whispered, his fingers frozen over the keys. The game around him, what he thought was just a game, began to warp, subtly at first. The trees swayed in unnatural ways. The buildings flickered, as if someone were messing with their structure. He tapped the keyboard again, just to see if it was some kind of error. Instead, the world responded. Buildings reformed themselves as if obeying his will. The NPCs, once passive bystanders, suddenly turned toward him and bowed. "You are the creator," they said in unison, their voices too perfect, too synchronized. "What will you command?" Jian's eyes widened. What did I just do? He rubbed his eyes, thinking he must have hit a key combination that triggered some experimental feature. But no. It felt too real. Too weird. A sudden chuckle escaped his lips. Maybe it was a prank. His co-workers were known for messing with him, sending him into ridiculous quests to find bugs or hidden features. But this? This was next level. Jian couldn't help but laugh. He was the creator. In a virtual world? This was too easy. So, he decided to have some fun. Alright, NPCs, dance, Jian typed into the console, just to see what would happen. The NPCs froze for a moment, and then, as if controlled by a master choreographer, they began to dance. In sync. Ridiculously so. It wasn't just simple dancing, either. They started flipping through the air, performing impossible moves, their bodies contorting into bizarre shapes. Jian laughed so hard that he nearly fell off his chair. He wasn't just changing the game, he was rewriting it. He felt a thrill. He could control it. He could change anything. After a few more experiments, making NPCs start a mock rebellion against each other, making the environment erupt into chaos with a single keystroke, Jian finally decided to exit. He had to get some sleep. Tomorrow would be another long day at Vireal Tech, after all, but as he removed his headset, something felt wrong. The world around him was off. His apartment, usually dim and gray, now seemed overly bright. His coffee machine, which had been broken for weeks, suddenly buzzed to life. The elevator in his building, which had been malfunctioning, smoothly carried him up to his floor. Was this all a coincidence? Then he pulled out his phone and checked his bank account. He hadn't touched his finances in weeks, yet there was a large sum of money in his account. Someone had transferred it to him. Confusion flooded his mind. The only thing he had done differently was the code. The same code that had changed the game. The same code that seemed to have brought him power in the virtual world. It couldn't have affected the real world, could it? But then, he started noticing more strange things. People around him began acting differently. He'd pass by the street corner where he usually saw his neighbor, Mrs. Zhao, and this time, instead of the usual scowl, she smiled at him and waved. When he entered his office building the next morning, his boss Tina, who had spent weeks breathing down his neck about missed deadlines, suddenly congratulated him for his brilliant contributions to the company. This wasn't just a glitch anymore. Jian had done something. Something he didn't understand. He quickly checked the code again. But this time, it wasn't there. It had vanished, as if it had never existed, and yet, everything around him had changed. Jian sat there for hours, staring at the blank screen. The code was gone. Just like that, as if it had never existed. But everything around him had changed. The reality he had once known seemed warped, like a subtle, disorienting dream. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something, someone, was waiting for him to do something. The next day at work, Jian barely heard the chatter of his colleagues around him as he sat at his desk. His mind was still preoccupied with the events of the previous night. Had he lost his mind? Had all of that really happened? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to code. Instead, he scrolled through old files, looking for something familiar, something to anchor him back to the world he understood. The world of logic. The world of software. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Luo Tian, his childhood friend and self-proclaimed hacker. "Got any new toys to play with?" it read, followed by a laughing emoji. Jian stared at the message. He hesitated. What was he supposed to say? How could he explain what had happened? He'd barely begun to wrap his mind around it himself. Another message popped up. "Yo, you still there? I'm bored. Found something cool online. Maybe you'll like it." Jian typed back, not thinking much, just trying to keep things normal. "What's up?" Luo Tian's reply came almost instantly. "I found some weird code in a VR game. You'll love this. I think it's a backdoor or something. You in?" Jian's pulse quickened. A backdoor? His mind raced as he considered what it could mean. The last time he'd dealt with something like that, it hadn't been by accident. It had been deliberate. This had to be a coincidence, right? But then again, what if it wasn't? What if the code he had found the night before was part of something bigger? Before he could respond, Luo Tian's next message appeared. Come on, don't leave me hanging. His fingers danced across the screen, typing in a quick response, send it over. Luo Tian wasted no time. Within moments, a link appeared in the chat. Jian clicked it without thinking, his heart pounding. The page loaded. It was a piece of code, buried deep in an old VR game that Jian had never heard of. Looks like some old stuff, Jian typed. Where'd you find this? Luo's response came almost immediately. It was hidden in an old server backup. Why was it still there? And why is it so clean? Feels like something the game devs didn't want anyone to find. Jian studied the code closely. It was eerily familiar. It had the same minimalistic, almost perfect structure that the code from the night before had. Could it be? Was this the same code? It had to be. His hands shook slightly as he typed. Can you run it? He asked, though a part of him was terrified of what might happen. Luo Tian, ever the thrill seeker, replied without hesitation. Hell yeah, let's see what happens. Ready to break something? Jian didn't answer. Instead, he watched as Luo Tian's screen lit up with a string of commands, one after the other. The virtual environment flickered, and for a split second, Jian thought he saw the same message from before, access granted. Welcome, creator. It was just like the glitch in the game, only now, it wasn't just a glitch, it felt real. His breath caught in his throat. He had to act fast. No, stop. Jian typed, but it was too late. Luo Tian had already executed the command. The world around them seemed to freeze, as if the entire virtual game had paused. Jian felt an eerie silence fill the space. And then, a new message popped up on the screen, creator detected. Initiating protocol. Before Jian could even process it, the virtual landscape began to change. It wasn't just a game anymore, it felt like they were being pulled into something much larger. Something alive. The textures, the lighting, the very environment, it all morphed before their eyes. Luo Tian gasped. What the hell is this? I don't know, Jian muttered, his heart racing. His hands trembled as he typed rapidly, trying to break the connection, but every time he tried, the system seemed to push back, locking him deeper into the environment. It was like being trapped inside the game. Only it wasn't the game. It was real. Too real. They were no longer sitting in the same office. They weren't even in their physical bodies anymore. They were avatars, hovering in the middle of a vast digital expanse. Jian looked at his own hands, transparent, glowing with digital code, like a part of the game itself. This is insane. Luo Tian yelled, his voice full of excitement and terror. But before he could finish, a new figure appeared in front of them. It was a woman, tall, commanding, and strangely familiar. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her movements were graceful yet deliberate. Jian's breath caught in his throat as she spoke. You have accessed the creator's protocol, she said, her voice echoing through the strange, shifting environment. Welcome. Jian's mind spun. It was her. The figure from his dreams, from the night before. The one who had said, "You are the creator." But this time, she wasn't just a digital entity. She was real. Luo Tian's voice broke through Jian's thoughts. Who are you? The woman's smile was almost pitying. I am Nina. I was the one who created the protocol you have activated. The code you've stumbled upon is not a game, and it is not an accident. You have been chosen. Jian's heart pounded in his chest. Chosen? For what? Nina's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. The code is not just a game. It is a key. A key to control both the virtual and the real world. And right now, both are on the verge of collapse. Luo Tian scoffed. What are you talking about? This is some kind of prank, right? Nina's gaze turned cold, almost sorrowful. This is no prank. The collapse has already begun. The virtual world was never meant to entertain, it was meant to protect. You, Jian-Yi, have the power to stop the impending destruction. But you must understand, this power comes with a price. You cannot control both worlds without consequence. Jian stood frozen, his mind racing. Power? Consequences? The weight of her words settled on him like a physical force. He had no idea what she was talking about, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had already changed. What are you saying? Jian whispered. Nina's eyes softened. The virtual world is a simulation created to save humanity from an apocalyptic event. The system was designed to test, to prepare. And now, you must decide, will you let the real world fall, or will you use the code to reshape both worlds? Jian's world tilted. It felt like everything around him was slipping away. The virtual and the real, his job, his life, his very sense of what was possible, it was all falling apart. And now, he had to choose. Before he could respond, the world around him flickered again, this time more violently, as if something was trying to break through the code itself. The sky above them twisted into strange, unreadable patterns. Nina looked at him, her expression unreadable. You must choose now, she said. The decision cannot wait any longer. Jian felt his heart race, his thoughts scattered. The code. The power. The choices. Was it too much? Could he save both worlds? Or was this the beginning of something far worse than he could understand? And before he could make sense of it all, the ground beneath them began to shift. The ground beneath Jian's feet shuddered violently, as if something deep within the virtual world had been disturbed. He staggered forward, instinctively reaching out for Luo Tian, but the air around them distorted. The world they stood in began to warp, like a piece of reality being twisted and stretched by unseen hands. His heart thudded in his chest, a feeling of imminent danger curling in his stomach. Nina remained perfectly still, her eyes locked onto Jian's, her expression unchanging. The strange, shifting environment surrounding them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, fluctuating between moments of perfect clarity and chaotic distortion. It's already happening, Nina said, her voice barely audible above the increasingly loud hum of the world around them. The boundaries are starting to collapse. You have to act now. Jian's mind was racing. What was she talking about? The system, the code, it was too much for him to grasp, too overwhelming. The world around him was on the verge of disintegration, and he was supposed to make a choice. The weight of it all felt suffocating. He had no idea how to stop it, how to even begin to understand what Nina was asking of him. Act? Jian croaked, his voice sounding distant, even to himself. What am I supposed to do? How? Nina's gaze never wavered. The code you activated, it's the bridge between the two worlds. The virtual world, the real world, they are more connected than you think. And if the simulation collapses, so does reality. You are the creator now. You have the power to hold both worlds together. Or tear them apart. Jian could hardly process the implications of her words. A bridge between worlds? The virtual and the real? His mind reeled, trying to make sense of it, but there was no time to think, no time to hesitate. The shifting reality around them was only growing more unstable. Luo Tian's voice cut through the noise, panicked. Jian. What's happening? This isn't just a game anymore. This is real, isn't it? I don't understand. Jian turned to him, but his friend's face was already distorted by the shifting code, his features flickering in and out of focus like a corrupted file. His body was becoming less and less defined, a blur of colors and shapes. Jian's stomach dropped. "This isn't possible," Luo Tian shouted, his voice echoing with desperation. "This isn't real, Jian." "We're not." Before Luo Tian could finish, the entire environment fractured like glass. Jian felt a sharp tug, as though his very existence was being torn apart at the seams. The world, both virtual and real, seemed to buckle under an invisible pressure. His vision blurred, then went black. When Jian's senses returned, he was no longer standing in the chaotic world he had just left. Instead, he was back in the real world, but something was wrong. He was in his office, but the hum of the building, the distant sounds of conversations, were muffled. He looked around, disoriented, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Everything was eerily quiet, too still. Jian tried to move, but his body felt heavy, sluggish. It was as if he were trapped in a bubble, the real world's reality not quite aligning with his own perception. He glanced down at his hands. They were transparent, like they weren't really there, yet he could still feel them. His fingers twitched, and for a moment, he could have sworn the world around him flickered, that he was still inside the code. The thought hit him like a slap. He was in both the real world and the virtual world. The code, the key, it had done something to him, something he couldn't yet understand. The boundaries between the two worlds were fading, and Jian was caught between them, unable to tell where one ended and the other began. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. A voice, low and distant. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, but it was unmistakable. "Jian. Can you hear me?" It was Nina's voice. But it wasn't coming from anywhere around him. It was coming from within him, as though her words were part of the code itself. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on her voice. "Jian," Nina said again, this time more urgently, "you must listen. The collapse has begun. The simulation is destabilizing, and the real world will follow. The decision you make now will determine the fate of both worlds." Jian's mind was spinning. The virtual world, the real world, they were on the brink of destruction, and somehow, he was the one who held the key. But how could he save both? Could he even save either? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating him. "You must act, Jian," Nina's voice persisted, no longer distant but forceful, commanding. "This is your only chance." Jian opened his eyes, but the office around him was still a blur. He could see the outline of his desk, the faint glow of his computer screen, but everything was hazy. The code was inside him now, inextricably linked to his existence. He could feel it in the back of his mind, pushing him forward, urging him to make a choice. What if there was no way out? What if the collapse was inevitable? His hand reached for his phone instinctively, but when he looked at it, the screen was blank, the notifications faded. There was no escape from this reality. "You cannot hide from this," Nina's voice whispered, almost as if reading his thoughts. "You are the creator. Only you can rewrite the code, but it will come at a cost." Jian closed his eyes again, trying to focus. He had to make a choice, and soon. If he didn't, both worlds would crumble. But how? How could he possibly repair something so broken, so fragile? He could feel the weight of the code, like a heavy chain wrapped around his chest. It was all-consuming, a power that was too much to bear. It was as if he had become both the prisoner and the warden of the worlds, trapped in a reality that was slipping away. But then, a realization struck him that he was the creator. The power was his, but so was the responsibility. The worlds were fragile, but they weren't beyond saving. He had to rewrite the code, to restore the balance. It wasn't about control, it was about harmony. About preserving the worlds, not destroying them. The decision became clear. "Jian," Nina's voice softened. "It is time." With that, Jian reached deep within himself, into the core of the code that flowed through his veins, and began to rewrite it. His fingers flew across the virtual interface, working faster than he ever thought possible. Lines of code appeared before his eyes, unraveling the threads of the collapsing reality. stitching them back together. Each line he typed felt like a tug on the fabric of existence itself, but he kept going. He could feel the worlds around him beginning to stabilize, the distortions fading as he worked. The virtual world was repairing itself, piece by piece, and with each correction, the real world grew more solid, more tangible. Finally, as the last line of code fell into place, Jian felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The collapse had stopped. The worlds were safe, for now, but as he took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, a small, unsettling thought crept into his mind. What had he just done? The code was still in him, and the power that came with it. Was it truly over? Or had he just delayed the inevitable? He didn't have the answers. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jian felt the ground beneath his feet steady, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, both worlds could coexist.